This episode of Booked on Rock, the story of Gene Krupa, the legendary jazz drummer who's inspired several legendary classic rock drummers, including Keith Moon, John Bonham, Ringo Starr, and many more. That's next. Welcome back to Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Very excited to talk to this episode's guest, Elizabeth Rosenthal. She's the author of the brand new book on Gene Krupa. It's titled The Master of Drums, Gene Krupa and the Music He Gave the World. Liz, so great to talk to you.
Yes.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be here.
It's amazing how many classic rock drummers Gene Krupa influenced. Like we're talking John
Yes.
Bonham, Ringo Starr, Neil Peart of Rush, Peter Criss, Slim Jim Phantom of the Stray Cats,
Yes,
who wrote the
right.
foreword to the book. What is it about Gene Krupa that really, in particular, connected so much with rock and roll drummers?
I think really, in a way, he was like the first rock and roll drummer. I mean, he would never, ever call himself a rock drummer because the strange thing is that he didn't like rock music. Now, he liked rock drummers because he loved to talk to them and, talk shop with them and give them pointers or just, share ideas. But in terms of rock music, he didn't like it. But I think he realized that he was influencing the music just in terms of the beat, a heavy beat. But I think how this happened, a lot of the classic rock drummers would have seen, in fact, they did see the Gene Krupa story, that biopic that came out in late 1959. And even though the movie itself wasn't all that accurate, the music was. And in fact, Gene Krupa himself played or recorded everything that's on there. So it stars this young actor named Sal Mineo, but Gene Krupa actually played everything that you hear. That in itself it can be quite a revelation to anyone who's interested in drums or likes music. So you have somebody like Keith Moon who was totally blown away by Gene Krupa's music in that movie. And so that's when he decided to become a drummer. Isn't that something? I mean, you wouldn't really have had The Who without Keith Moon. But if you look at so many of these rock drummers, it was almost like even if they didn't know who Gene Krupa was, although most of them did, there was really a direct line of development between Gene's drumming in the 30s and 40s and beyond and rock drummers. A lot of them were what you would call a baby boomer. They grew up in the 50s. Their parents played Gene Krupa records. I know that for a fact. And they were mesmerized, and it was like a revelation to so many of them. And I'm talking about even the drummer who drummed on Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and the Comets. Can you imagine that? And so many of the early rock drummers, as well as drummers who came along in the 60s and 70s. You mentioned Peter Criss. There are so many classic rock bands. I mean, even Mountain, for example, they performed Mississippi Queen. And that was Corky Lang who played drums on that. The first drummer for Crosby, Stills and Nash. It's almost like you name the group, and that drummer was really, in all likelihood, influenced and, in fact, really admiring of Gene Krupa.
I also would think it also has to do with, especially with Keith Moon, his athletic physicality, the way he performed on the drums stood out,
Yes.
made him the star.
Right.
So that I can see also, if that's what
Yes.
rock and roll is. It's loud, it's boisterous, it's creating a lot of energy. It's not just
Yes.
sitting behind the kit and keeping a beat,
Yes.
And he was a
And
good looking guy. That's the other thing,
oh,
right?
yeah. Right. And, he was under a lot of criticism back when he was a young guy for doing just what you're talking about, but it came natural to him. He wasn't actually emulating anybody in particular when he did it. Whether you're just talking about his athletic moves or the expressions on his face or how he even moved his head, it all came to him naturally because he was actually living every beat as he played it. And this is not really something that most people in jazz, which was what his background was, really liked. In fact, most of them thought that the drummer should be really not paid attention to and not make too much of a spectacle out of himself. But that changed. He's the one who actually brought drummers out to the forefront of a band in the sense that they could become stars. He was the first drum star, and others, whether it was jazz or later rock, could become stars in their own right. If it hadn't been for him, that would not have happened.
Did he and Buddy Rich come along at the same time?
No, not really. Buddy Rich was 8 years younger, and Gene Krupa was already a seasoned drummer by the 1920s, a jazz drummer, and he came from Chicago, moved to New York, became actually a very sought after drummer for anybody who needed him, anybody who was looking for a drummer. He was the one who was most recommended and most in demand. So he was actually well known before he joined Benny Goodman, his first, the first band that where he became well known. Anyway, the point I'm making is he was a star and already influencing music and jazz before Buddy Rich even joined his first swing or jazz group. And in fact, Buddy Rich was profoundly influenced by Gene Krupa. Really, anything that you hear him play, and he had admitted this, really has its a source in Gene Krupa playing. And I'm talking stylistically. And no question that Buddy Rich was also very impressed by Gene, and they became really great friends. You may or may not know that.
I didn't know
Uh,
that. Oh.
yeah. And then so they had a mutual admiration society going on.
He was very athletic, as I mentioned. He was actually his passion was baseball. Gene Krupa. Talk about
Yes.
his childhood in Chicago, and then what was it that changed his mind and said, you know what, I love baseball, but drumming, this is what I want to do. There was a moment there where he
Right.
was working at a music store with his brother, I think.
Yes, he was right. He was a kind of a gopher, he was about 11 years old, a gopher in a music store, and he was looking through a catalog. He thought, well, I'd like to play a musical instrument, but what can I play? And he was looking through a catalog, and the cheapest musical instrument was a drum set. And this happened to be from Japan. And so it was easiest thing to buy because it was so inexpensive, relatively speaking. And his brother actually got it for him. And so then the rest is history. And he became incredibly devoted to it. It just became a passion with him and something that he could never let go of.
And he had tremendous drive. Right up, even when he was considered the best drummer around, he was still trying to get
Hmm.
better, which is so amazing.
Hmm.
Stories of him playing night and day, working on his skills. Talk about how he started taking lessons from Sanford Gus Moeller. First, for those
Yes.
who are not familiar with him, who was Sanford Moeller? And can you talk about Gene kept his real name from Sanford in the beginning when he first taught him?
Yes.
Talk about why he did that.
Yes, that's funny. Gene Krupa initially was not a school drummer initially, and he finally realized this is not going to work. He was actually the pit orchestra drummer for two George Gershwin musicals in the year 1930, Girl Crazy and Strike Up the Band. But Gene realized that he couldn't read music, so he didn't know when he was supposed to come in on the drums. And so he said, this is embarrassing. I can't just let this happen. I want to know everything about the drums. So then, yes, he approached Gus Moeller and did not tell him his real name because if he had, Gus Moeller would have heard of him because he was already such a big name circulating around the New York jazz and music circles. So I don't know what name that Gene gave him. I don't know who he said he was, but if he hadn't done that, then Gus Muller would probably have taught him differently. And Gene wanted to start at the bottom rung. He wanted to actually begin as if he didn't know anything about the drums and go from there. The funny thing is, so Gene was in the orchestra for it might have been Girl Crazy musical in the fall of 1930. And it just so happened that Gus Muller was in the audience and maybe the first or second row. And uh-oh,
I know that guy.
Gene
Yeah.
was busted.
So Gus was like the
You know,
go-to guy for drumming lessons. I mean,
yes.
he was it. Gene's showmanship. Talk about his approach to not just playing the beats but performing them. There was a word to describe it,
Uh-oh.
duende.
Duende, yeah. That was a word I came across that a writer back in actually I think it was around the time that Gene died. This writer named George Fraser mentioned that Gene had duende, and duende is basically it's hard to define, but it's basically sort of an emotional way of expressing yourself in the arts. It doesn't have to be music, but it has to be sort of a pure, unadulterated way of bringing forth your artistry to the audience. So it's a kind of thing where you don't hold back. It's not something where you're going to try to restrain yourself or say, oh, it's also something that's innate. So Gene played that way. He played innately. He played the way he felt. And it didn't matter if other people said, what's wrong with you? Why do you make such a big deal out of everything? I mean, from very early on, people were writing about him when he was in different early bands before becoming famous. They would say things like he's the comedian of the band, or he did everything except skate on the ceiling.
So Krupa made his first recordings in 1927 with a band under the leadership of Red McKenzie and guitarist Eddie Condon, and then he was on six
That's right.
recordings by the Thelma Terry Band in 28. 1934, this is the big year. He joins Benny Goodman's band, and this is where he
Hmm.
becomes a national celebrity. How does he become a part of Benny's band? This story is interesting because it wasn't something that Gene jumped at right away because he was
Hmm.
hesitant. There were a few previous jobs with Benny that left him a bit annoyed. Is that?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. I think if Gene had had his druthers, he would never have worked with Benny. After it's just Benny was kind of a strange person. He was a great musician, but I don't think he had very good people skills. He rubbed people the wrong way. He also, in one of the bands that Gene was in, I think it was the Russ Colombo band around 1933. Benny, it was his job to drive a really hard bargain as far as how much each musician would get paid. And it was something that a lot of the musicians in this band that he was helping to put together, Benny was helping to put together, really created a lot of resentment. And Gene definitely felt that himself. I mean, you're in the middle of the depression. You need to have a good paying job. And so that happened more than once, I think. But then again, they knew each other since the 1920s in Chicago. They knew each other since they were young teenagers. They didn't really get to know each other until Gene joined Benny's band, though, in 1934. And the reason he was persuaded to do so was that John Hammond, the one who brought him in and said, please, please come and join Benny's band, he said, you'll get to play a lot of drums, or the drums will be a big feature for you, which was an amazing promise to make. It was amazing. Gene was very attracted to that idea. And as a matter of fact, within a few months of him joining Benny Goodman, Gene himself was a big star and a very, very crucial part of the Benny Goodman Orchestra.
Benny knew he needed to step it up. That's why he wanted to take
Yes.
Gene and bring him in the band. He needed
Yes.
that swing. He needed to bring
Right.
that
That's
swing.
absolutely right. The other drummers that Benny had worked with when he was trying to get something together in 1934 were sort of the drummers who were sort of like drummers of the past. And Gene had actually, in particular, this one guy, Stan King, Gene had already sort of leapfrogged over him and working with this band leader named Red Nichols. So, in other words, Gene tended to supplant other drummers who just weren't forward thinking or as exciting or as good. And so it happened again. Stan King was the drummer for Benny Goodman, and Benny was underwhelmed. And I guess everybody was really underwhelmed. And Gene came in and really made the band explode. I guess there was really no way. It was something that they knew immediately once he joined, that this was going to be a big deal.
The band was sensational, but Gene and Benny weren't getting along. And from reading the book, it seems to me as if Benny was in a position where he knew he needed Gene, but he was envious of the attention that Gene was starting to get.
Yes.
And he was never going to treat Gene differently. He was always going to be the number two guy in the group. Was that the gist of
Hmm.
it? That was
Yeah,
the
but the number two guy is great,
yeah.
and kind of amazing. You wouldn't normally expect the drummer to be the guy. If Benny needed help, advice, if Benny had to go away somewhere and needed someone to rehearse the band, that was Gene. That was his job. I think he called himself the concert master. But yes, he was the highest paid sideman in the band, and in fact, in the swing or jazz world. The jazz at the time was called swing. So that's why I'm referring to that in case some people don't know. But he was the highest paid sideman in swing during that time that he was with Benny Goodman. And that showed the value that he had and how much he was valued by his colleagues as well as all the dancers and people who loved the band who came to dance and came to watch.
The song Sing, Sing, Sing. People may not recognize the song title, but as soon as you hear the start of it, you recognize it because it's been in movies, it's been in television, it's been everywhere.
Yes.
And that was recorded by Benny Goodman in 1937, but it was first recorded by Louis Prima in 1936
Hmm.
and made famous by Goodman and especially Gene Krupa. His tom-tom interludes on the song were the first extended drum solos to be recorded commercially. We have to go back to when Gene has fully tunable toms, which are developed by the company Singerland. Can you give us the
Except that it was
backstory?
Gene's idea for Slingerland to create fully tunable tom-toms
Oh, I
on top
gotcha.
and bottom.
So
Yeah,
that was his
that's
idea. Yeah, yeah. Give us the
right.
backstory regarding that and also the cultural impact of that song.
As far as the fully tunable tom-toms, he was the celebrity endorser essentially of Slingerland drums. And Gene was always looking for ways to sound and play better on the drums. And he was always trying to get away from the corny aspect that drums were known for back when he was growing up. You know, they played all sorts of, there were all sorts of gadgets that played corny sounds and funny, silly sounds. And Gene wanted to strip down the drum set to just a very few essential components. Then he realized, you know, he loved making different sounds, but he wanted to do it himself, not with silly gadgets. And one way to make better sounds and have a greater impact was to have tom toms that he could really work with, and not just have one sound come out of them, but a whole variety. And so, really, that his idea for doing that. And he had other ideas for Slingerland drums too, as well as Zildjian cymbals. But that idea of the fully tunable toms is really what made Sing 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 possible, or made his drumming on Sing 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 as excellent and as exciting as it was.
So that was revolutionary, really, what he was developing there, because to this day that's used.
Yeah, and in fact, the drum kit that he preferred and that Slingerland ultimately then promoted became everybody's drum set. Those very basic items, you know, the snare, the bass, rack tom and floor tom, and about three cymbals, and the cowbell. That was the one sort of cute item that he retained from the corny days of the 1920s. And of course, that featured prominently in the song Sing, Sing, Sing at the end when he really let loose. To me, just the most hair raising kind of conclusion to any song that I've ever heard.
Yeah, and you have to put yourself in that time too, where people hadn't heard anything like that before. So,
That's right. Well, the interesting thing also about Sing 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 is that Gene was actually responsible for how it developed because they first started doing it really simply, you know, because it actually had lyrics. And so you could sing it.
oh, the Louis
And
Prima version had
yeah,
lyrics. Yeah, that's what I was
yeah,
wondering
that's
too.
right.
Did the Louis Prima version have that drum? Did it have the opening? Did it have all those solos? No.
No, no, no,
So,
no, no. It was just basically a pop song. The drums didn't have any particular, at the time, didn't have any particular important role to play. I think later on, you know, after Gene had done what he did, then Louis Prima, I think, brought drums out to, because everybody was doing that. That is, after Gene showed what you could do with the drums and became so famous playing the drums, then everybody wanted to do what he was doing. So when the Benny Goodman band initially started playing it, they had their vocalist Helen Ward was singing the song, but then eventually something happened, and it might have started with Gene, where he said, "Well, I think I would like to play more of an intro." I mean, he had a little bit of a tom tom intro that really sort of had that an African sound or sort of a Caribbean kind of a sound or a Latin sound. And he just kept stretching it. In other words, it would start with maybe four measures and then it would go to any number. And then once he started stretching out his part, then the rest of the band started stretching out their parts or added things. They just added a whole, they threw the whole kitchen sink in that song. And it became so different from what it originally had sounded like. But of course, during that time, they realized they didn't need Helen Ward to sing the song. It was much better just as a very exciting instrumental.
Elizabeth Rosenthal, the author of the brand new book on Gene Krupa titled The Master of Drums, Gene Krupa and the Music He Gave the World. Let's talk about Gene Krupa, the person. Bassist Milt Hamilton called Gene a beautiful man, and many others
Yeah.
had similar comments. Talk about Gene Krupa, the person.
That's the amazing thing is, I mean, as talented as he was and as exciting as he was as a musician, he was also just as wonderful a guy. Now, he was a mentor to loads of young musicians. There were loads of acts of kindness. He did things people didn't ask for. He sort of led them and showed them how what they could do and how they could be. The later drummer Mel Lewis was just a kid at the time when Gene was had his band in the 1940s, and he was just a kid, but he actually traveled with the band, and so he was considered Gene's little pal. And Mel Lewis, as I said, was a drummer and was profoundly influenced by Gene and at the same time was treated like a son. And this happened with a lot of young kids. And in fact, it was like the thing for young boys to want to be just like Gene Krupa. Yeah, he had neighbors who he embraced, regardless of the fact that he was a huge star and they were not in show business. So he had a lot of friends in and out of music and treated everybody the same. There's also one instance, which is a really good, or a couple of good examples of how Gene Krupa was as a person. He started playing in the 1950s with a group, well, it was sort of an aggregation called Jazz at the Philharmonic. And despite the name, they didn't stay at the Philharmonic in Los Angeles. They traveled all over the world. But be that as it may, when he first joined, the person who sort of organized it and made it a going concert, Norman Granz, said to Gene, because Gene was such a big star, he said, Gene, do you want to fly in your own private plane when we go to the different gigs? And Gene said, What? Why would I want that? I'm no better than anybody else.
Wow.
And Norman Granz was surprised because, Gene was a huge star. Why wouldn't he want to be treated like a huge star? Gene didn't feel like that. I mean, he knew what he was as a star, but he also knew as a person he loved to be around other people. And he loved to just enjoy the simple things with other people. Another interesting instance of him showing his humility was actually in the early 60s when this vibraphonist named Terry Gibbs had a band, and Gene's own quartet was playing in this place called the Metropole Cafe in Times Square, Manhattan. But then different bands played at different times at the Metropole Cafe. So after Gene played, he had his all the equipment was still on the stage, and it was a very small stage. And so Terry Gibbs and his people needed room, and so they started moving Gene's drum kit aside so they could have some room. And so the manager came along and said, You can't do that. That's Gene Krupa's drum set. You can't touch it. And the manager also said, Gene is the star. He's a big star. You can't do that. Then Gene, who was nearby, he heard what was going on. He came over and said, Excuse me, when I'm playing, I'm the star. When Terry Gibbs is playing, he's the star. So go ahead, please move my drums.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That is cool. And you could see Benny Goodman, like you said, Benny Goodman was the opposite, I guess, polar opposite. Not that the different personalities, kind of oil and
Yeah.
water. And about after
Yeah.
what 3-4 years, he split with the band. And he went out on his own in March of 1938. But the last few weeks with Benny Goodman were not fun, you say in the book. In fact, things
No.
got heated on stage, and Gene, who rarely lost his temper, and he rarely swore, but there was
Yes.
one particular night he couldn't hold back.
Well, after the Carnegie Hall concert that they played in January of 1938, there's such a big to do about it, but Gene especially let loose during that concert. And I recommend, by the way, anybody, if even if you're a rock fan and you're not familiar with jazz, get that album. I just want to mention that because it is like, to me, it's like the first rock concert. It's that exciting. And
Really?
and not just because of Gene, although he was a big factor in that, but the music was just it was really it went for the jugular. It was that sort of music. It was that exciting. Anyway, so I had mentioned earlier that John Hammond had persuaded. He was somebody who was always trying to create musical situations and discovered Count Basie band. So John was Hammond was always hanging around and trying to. He was whispering in Benny Goodman's ear, Gene is getting an awful lot of attention, and you're not getting as much attention as he is. And doesn't that bother you? I mean, maybe he's really overdoing it. And Benny was rather susceptible to that idea because he was kind of feeling like that. And so Benny started trying to tamp down Gene's duende, essentially. And Gene was, frustrated and, not happy with that. And in fact, the audiences were not happy with that. They would say, "Hey, Gene, play, come on, let's see what you do."
We
And
paid for the
Gene,
ticket, man. We want to see him do his thing.
yeah, and Gene basically pointed at Benny and said, "Hey, I can't." It got kind of worse and worse. And then finally, Gene, toward the end of that time, I guess I don't even know if he gave 2 weeks' notice, but in any case, there was one night where he said, "Eat some shit, Pops." And that was, he said that to Benny Goodman.
Yeah.
And not his usual way of talking, but he was really pissed off. And yes, he was a very even-tempered guy. He's not the kind of guy who just got angry, or he was not an explosive. He was a very calm, even-tempered guy. So yeah, he did that. But the thing is, he was already searching for members of the band that he wanted to put together. So he was really going to leave anyway. It's just that he left in a kind of acrimonious way.
And it appears as if he got hotter after he left Benny's band. I mean, what happened in the years that followed? He had film work, fan clubs started popping up.
Yes, that's right. He started making movies in 1939. Now, it was really just him and his band playing at different points in the movies that he was in. He was not, some people said, oh, he was a matinee idol. Well, that's not really true. Even though there was one point where he had the opportunity to become a matinee idol and he turned it down and said, that's not what I want to do, and it's not what my fans would want me to do. But he was in a number of movies, including with Bob Hope and Gary Cooper and other big stars at the time. The thing that was great was that when Gene had his own band, he could do what he wanted. He didn't have to worry about anybody breathing down his neck. Benny wasn't going to be staring at him. That was one of the things that Benny Goodman used to do. He used to essentially intimidate members of his band by giving them what was called the ray. And that just meant a very intense stare at them, which seemed to mean that he disapproved of what they were playing.
Oh, man.
But anyway, so and Benny may not have realized he was doing that, but he did it. So Gene didn't have to worry about that anymore. So he could become even more innovative. You may or may not be familiar with this early song that he recorded called "Wire Brush Stomp," which was all played on brushes, but it was a very rocking song. And that was actually debuted in the movies. It was called Some Like It Hot, and it was a Bob Hope movie, not to be confused with the more famous later one with Jack Lemmon
And
and
Marilyn
Jack Lemmon,
and
Tony
Tony
Curtis.
Curtis.
But
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of that, I watched Turner Classics all the time. I mean, that was my thing. My dad and I, that was our, so many things we bonded over. But I don't think I've ever seen the Sal Mineo film.
they've shown it a couple of times. I mean, it's good to see because of the music that Gene Krupa plays. Now, Sal Mineo mimes to his music, and he did a really good job, and he studied Gene's physical style. So he really did an excellent job of playing Gene as a musician. It was remarkable. And again, this movie was one of the things that inspired so many guys to become rock drummers. The thing I didn't like was one time they were showing it, and one of the hosts this was when there were different biopics they were showing of the different swing stars like Glenn Miller, and then Benny Goodman had his own movie, and Gene was a third big band guy who had his own movie. And so they were showing Turner Classic Movies was showing these movies one after the other. And so the remark was made, well, I guess Gene wasn't as nice a guy as Glenn Miller was. And Glenn Miller was played by Jimmy Stewart, who was
Right.
always a nice guy. And that was not true. The script may have made him seem a little less nice than he should have been, but Gene was not like that. There was no way that you could not say he was not a nice guy, not humble. He was always polite, always welcoming, but for some reason that you don't get quite that idea from the movie. So I was just kind of annoyed, though, that the host took that for granted.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
could that be because, this is a question I was going to ask, could that be because there was a drug charge in 1943? Did that affect his
yeah.
image at that time? Because that
Oh,
was,
oh,
he was
it
90-day
did.
jail sentence. What
It,
happened?
it it was terrible. And this had to do with marijuana. And nowadays, marijuana is pretty much legal everywhere, and it's not even a big deal anymore. But at the time, marijuana was very popular with jazz and swing musicians. It just was one of those things that was part of the culture. It was certainly not a bad thing. It was just something that they did, and I guess it made them relaxed. And Louis Armstrong was probably the champ when it came to marijuana use.
Wow.
So Gene was having a difficult time at this point in 1942, early 1943. He had given up marijuana for a while. He had promised his wife before they got married he would do that. He started smoking it again. Not a lot, but at the time, the government, the federal government, was making a big deal out of the dangers of marijuana and making it into a drug that was completely, they were making it sound like it was so dangerous it could change your personality, make you a totally different, horrible person, kill people, etc.
Really?
And yeah,
Wow.
and they were just so essentially demonizing anybody who used it. And some of this had to do, or maybe a lot of it had to do with racial views concerning Mexican immigrants or Mexicans who lived here. I'm not really sure of the exact connection, except that marijuana is a Spanish word. So there was bigotry involved, but jazz and swing guys were still by, the mainstream people, by parents, older people. It was not something that was acceptable, if that can be believed. Just like rock became something that was shocking, and the older generation didn't like it. It was the same with swing music and the big bands.
Oh yeah, my dad
So
said that too. He goes, those guys were like rock stars.
yeah,
Glenn Miller
yeah,
and those guys. Yeah.
yeah, and there'd be complaints by people not familiar with it. Boy, that was too loud.
Right.
I came out of there with my head pounding and all this sort of thing. But people like Gene, the feds were interested in going after people and making examples of them. And they did that with Gene. Basically, they didn't find very much. They did arrest him in San Francisco, and this was in January of 1943. He was fingerprinted, all that, those sorts of embarrassing things, and the headlines were pretty bad.
Yeah, the media
But
was cruel to him.
very cruel. Some of the columnists were saying that, his career is over, or the church is going to get him now, or things
Yeah.
like that. He actually was able, before the trial, he was actually able to continue to play until the trial was scheduled. So during that time, his fans still loved him as much as ever and came to see him in droves. So the fans did not care. But it's just that other, the powers that be and other people who were just worried about image, those people cared. So, Gene, he pled guilty to a misdemeanor having to do with his band boy carrying or having marijuana on his person. And then there was also a felony charge, which of course is a lot bigger and would involve prison time. So Gene pled guilty at the recommendation of his lawyer to the misdemeanor, pled not guilty to the felony. And so the misdemeanor, it turned out the judge wanted him to spend 90 days in jail. And this was actually a shock because his lawyer, Jake Ehrlich, who was a very experienced guy who represented people in a lot of notorious criminal cases in San Francisco, he thought that Gene was only going to have to pay $500 fine and that would be the end of it. No, he had to spend 90 days in jail. And during the jail time, that's when he was put on trial for the felony. And it was a disaster. It was a legal disaster. It was really, they railroaded him and he was convicted. Fortunately, his attorney appealed, and then a year later, the appeals court in California struck down the conviction on the felony, and it was just because of double jeopardy. So they weren't even saying that he didn't do it. They just said he already pled guilty to the misdemeanor, which was essentially just basically the same circumstances as the felony. So once you did that, you really can't then prosecute him on the felony. So that's double jeopardy.
That really hit him hard, though, mentally and emotionally. It took him a while. He slowly but surely came back from that, but
He was
he took it
he was
hard.
petrified.
Right.
He was of course demoralized. He was who I mean nobody wants to spend time in jail for 90 days.
Right.
As far as I know, he was not treated badly or anything, but still it was jail.
Sure.
And he was actually ended up staying for a little longer than the 90 days because the prosecutor wasn't in any hurry. The administrators of the jail were not in any hurry to let him go because, he was convicted of the felony, which was on appeal. So his attorney had to get him out of jail again, where Gene had to pay another bail. There were, I think, three instances of him having to post bail. So that's how he got into jail. And yeah, demoralized, thinking his career was over, embarrassed. What was great was that other band leaders loved him as a person, even Benny Goodman. I mean,
That's what
Benny
I was
Goodman
gonna
not
say.
being,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
That, oh,
I mean, he was
suddenly,
not a,
Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, right? Those are the two big ones that
yes,
gave him
yeah,
some
they,
gigs, got him back on his
exactly.
feet.
Right. Benny Goodman was the first, and then Tommy Dorsey several months after that. And Gene was petrified, even just starting out again as a sideman. It was, basically he was demoted from being a band leader to a sideman. He was worried how he would be perceived. First he would be playing to guys in the military during the war, of course, at military bases. And then he thought, well, maybe they appreciated me, but, they're soldiers. And then there was the idea of going in and playing in ballrooms. Then he thought, well, he was very well received there too. Everybody loved him there too. And he thought, well, okay, that's good, but what about the movie theaters? Because they also played movie theaters in between the movies. Bands would
Wow.
perform, and so he said, then he's thinking, well, okay, those two other things, the ballroom and the soldiers, they like me, but what about the average moviegoer? And in each case, it was like pandemonium. Of course, the real pandemonium would have been created by the teenagers and college kids who were in the audiences and were thrilled to see him, particularly in the theaters. But he wasn't expecting that. He essentially cried.
Yeah.
And later, a few months later, in those days, and maybe even now, men didn't want to be thought of as showing emotion, that kind of emotion publicly. So he said, well, in an interview, he said, well, listen, let's just say I didn't cry. Let's just say I felt hot and cold all over. That was
Yeah.
his. And but he did, and it was just such a groundswell of affection, and people who were there and talked about it later. Ed Shaughnessy became a well-known drummer, played with Doc Severinsen and Johnny Carson's orchestra, and he was there as a kid when Gene made his comeback. And so a lot of these young drummers who would go on to become successful actually witnessed what happened, and it was very moving. And anyway, so once the California Court of Appeals struck down his conviction on the felony, he was able to go, or he felt that he could now go and reassemble his band and take it from there.
He played right up until he passed away. He was married to two women, but it was one, Ethel, who appeared to be the love of his life. They married, divorced, later remarried. Talk about where they met,
Yeah.
and that special bond they apparently seem to have.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a funny thing the way they met. I think it might have been as early as 1930, but anyway, he was playing in New York, and musicians, of course, would perform late into the night, and so they weren't the type of people. If they didn't have to, they would not be getting up early, so they would sleep into the afternoon, and that's what Gene did, and he needed a wake up call in the afternoon. And so Ethel was one of the telephone operators, and it was her job to give him a wake up call. And they sort of hit it off on the phone, and chatted, and so became more than just a wake up call. And then he thought, well, he sort of liked how she sounded on the phone. He asked somebody if they could show him who she was, and he thought, oh, she's really cute. And so it took a month for him to get a first date with her, but they did, and then not that long afterward they got married, and they had troubles, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was a traveling musician and she wanted to settle down. And that's a tough thing because usually, unless you have a local job, you're going to be traveling around, and your spouse is not necessarily going to be thrilled with that.
But was it later years
So
when he started? He had unhurried time, is what you call it. Was that when they got back together? Maybe when he was home more.
it was actually only about 4 years after they got divorced, they remarried. And Gene actually felt obligated to do that. He was a practicing Catholic, and I'm Jewish. I don't know very much about Catholicism, but he felt that it was the right thing to do by the Catholic Church. And so that's how they got remarried. But the funny thing is that between their divorce and the time they got remarried, they were dating a lot. The gossip columnists kept saying, "Oh, guess who Gene Krupa was seen with today?" Yes, it was Ethel, his ex-wife. And so for a long time there were these rumors about when are they going to get married again, etc. And finally, after some time, when there were rumors going back and forth, when is he going to buy her a ring, etc., etc., it finally happened. And in early 1946, they went on a little honeymoon to Mexico. And so then they were married until she died, which was the end of 1955. And that was a shock because she was young, only in her 40s. On the one hand, he was a wonderful person. On the other hand, he did have a flaw of which a lot of musicians did, seeing other women. Not that I mean, if it had happened to me, if my husband did that, um,
Yeah.
obviously it would be a major problem. And
But they must have been
um,
women. Must have been all over him all the
yeah,
time. I mean,
he
the
was, yes, he was somebody that women of whatever age, young, older, they were enraptured by him. But since they had these differences about his musicianly lifestyle, that is, the differences between him and his wife, you could say that was the reason for his essentially being unfaithful at different times. However, when Ethel started developing these symptoms that turned out to be a brain aneurysm, but they didn't know it at the time. She was having all these terrible headaches, and he was very worried about her. Gene was very worried about her, and he stayed by her side. He couldn't possibly leave her or do anything. He felt that it was his duty to be a to be there for her, and he was.
and he was. He had what you called unhurried time in the late 60s and early 70s. He was enjoying his life. He certainly earned it by that point. But then his health started to
He,
fail around
Well,
73.
that's really why he retired. On the one hand, yeah, he retired in 1967. On the one hand, yes, it was unhurried time during the years until he died in 1973. He got to enjoy his house. He had built this really big, beautiful house in the early 40s in Yonkers, but he was never home to enjoy it, or hardly at home, let's just say. But unfortunately, I mean, if it were up to him, he'd still be playing. He still would have been performing, but things kept going wrong. In 1960, he had a heart attack, but he went back on the road anyway after a while because he got kind of bored.
Yeah.
And in 1967, he was diagnosed with emphysema. Now, he was a very, very, very heavy smoker.
Okay. That's what I was wondering.
So it's not, not a surprise that he would have had a heart attack and then developed emphysema. And the emphysema really brought him down for a while, I guess, until maybe he had to take medications, but there was a period where he did not have the energy to do much of anything except hang around the house. And then he was just starting to get back into it, doing some performing in 1970 when he threw his back out. He loved playing softball. He had a local softball team, and there was a freak accident where he tripped somehow and just then some discs in his back popped out. I'm not exactly sure, but anyway, it was a very bad injury. And he had surgery, and he was never the same after that. And when he tried to do some more performing, he could barely do any, maybe a couple times a month. It got to that point. And then around the spring of 1973, and he was wondering, why does he feel so tired? It wasn't just like being tired after having been active or something. He was just tired all the time. It was leukemia. And so then he was gone 6 months later. And that was a bad time for him because even though he was sort of in demand, Benny got the quartet back together.
Yeah. Yeah. August of
Um, and
73. He
yeah.
he manages
And
to not only make it to the show somehow, but there were those who were there that comment in the book about people saw him limping up to the drum kit, and then all of a sudden, as soon as the song kicked in, it was like he just all of a sudden
yeah,
came to life. And
right.
and then
And then
after the
afterward,
show, yeah, they had to
then
carry
he
him.
couldn't even stand up after
Right.
that.
Yeah. I mean, they,
Right.
they seemed to be astonished just by how he looked, and then, but once the song kicked in,
Yeah.
there was, Gene Krupa was back again. He's putting everything into it. But
Yeah.
the,
But
the
it took a lot out of him
he was how
and
old again? Was he in his 60s when he passed? He was very
well,
young.
yeah, he was only 64 when he died.
Right,
And
right.
you know what? I'm almost 65. That was really young. It's still young to me.
Yeah.
I mean, there were a lot of musicians who, of course, outlived him by many years. And Gene was, unfortunately, despite his zest for life and his ambitions and his love of music and being around musicians and other people, he couldn't do anything about it. The leukemia, essentially, what it did was it took a huge toll on his heart. And so ultimately it was heart failure, I believe, that got him. But anyway, he was very young. So it's
Yeah.
not like
But
he was some old guy who died of,
sure,
old
sure.
age or
But he made his mark, and that's what I want to finish with. Chapter 26 is
yes.
devoted to his influence on rock drummers, and you point this out in the book, and this says it all. Keith Moon, John Bonham, Ringo Starr are considered to be the holy trinity of rock drummers, and all three are Gene Krupa fans. That just tells it
Yes.
all right there. They're admirers, students
Hmm.
of his skills. But we're not just talking about classic rock drummers, and this is interesting. I want to ask you about his influence on genres like surf rock and punk.
Oh, yes. You would never imagine that. But there was this musician named Dick Dale, who
Dick
many
Dale.
consider to be the founder of surf rock. And it was, of course, it was a certain kind of guitar sound with a reverberation and kind of on the aggressive side. And Dick Dale was a huge Gene Krupa fan, and he decided that he was going to try to play his guitar like Gene Krupa played the drums, which was an interesting way of looking at his musicianship. But so he did that, and of course, Dick Dale influenced many other groups that became known for surf rock, whether it was the Surfaris or the Ventures and other groups of that sort. Even the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys, they were sort of an offshoot in the sense that they were very influenced by the Ventures, who had been very influenced by Gene. So you can almost say that the Beach Boys might not have been what they were except for Gene Krupa. And as far as punk, who would have thought that punk rock drummers would look to him? But you had someone like Jerry Nolan, who was a punk drummer for a couple of different bands, including the New York Dolls. But when Jerry Nolan was a kid in the 1960s, and he did what a lot of other people did. Gene Krupa was playing with his quartet at the Metropole Cafe in New York. And if you were underage, you couldn't go in, unescorted, that is. You could only stand outside and see what was going on. And they would have the door open so you could hear what was going on. Jerry Nolan was one of those people. Actually, he was with his mother at the time outside and looking in, and then finally got to meet him inside. His mother got him inside. And Jerry Nolan was so blown away. In fact, was very influenced by Gene's style and also the way he expressed himself while playing the drums. And so Jerry Nolan found him to be a wonderful person, a wonderful kind of a mentor, as well as someone to emulate on the drums. And apparently, Jerry Nolan has been considered the most influential of the punk rock drummers. So there you have it, Gene Krupa, all the way to from the big bands to punk rock.
There's a great story Peter Criss has told, and it's in his book. And
Hmm.
the specifics I may be getting a little off, but Peter Criss was a teenager and he got a chance to see Gene play in a club in New York. And Peter Criss was just an unknown, and he went up to Gene after the show, and I think he said like Gene had the towel over around his neck, just sweating after another great performance. But
Hmm.
he just he said, I'm a huge fan, and I want to be a drummer. You got any tips for me or whatever? And he said he was just so gracious and so kind
Hmm.
to this kid who he never met before. And Peter Criss
Right.
has told that story many times. I mean, that's the one classic rock
Yes.
drummer that I could just so many times he's mentioned
Yes.
Gene Krupa, and
He.
you can hear it in the early Kiss records. It's got that
Mhm.
swing to it. It's got that jazz swing
Yeah.
to that early Kiss sound.
Right. There was certainly a stylistic influence, no question about that. I just wanted to mention Ringo Starr for a minute
Right.
because the funny thing is that there seems to be a direct line from some of Gene Krupa's recordings with his orchestra in the 40s and what Ringo Starr played with the Beatles. And there's one particular song called The End, I believe it's The End, where it starts off with this amazing riff by Ringo on the drums. And although it wasn't a particularly complicated drum passage, nevertheless, it was pretty similar to what Gene was doing in the early 40s with his band in some cases. you'd hear the end and think, gee, that sounds like Gene Krupa. And then if you go back in the early 40s and hear something like there was a song called Stop the Red Lights On, and there was a part where Gene sort of took out the song or brought the song along toward the end, and the sound, you think, oh my gosh, that sounds like classic rock what he's doing there with his
Absolutely.
drums.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, you could
Yeah.
hear it. There's like you could draw a straight line right from Gene right through to that classic rock era. And I would say a lot of the drummers even today, I'm sure, are inspired by Gene
Hmm.
Krupa, either consciously or subconsciously. They don't even
Oh
realize it,
yeah.
you know? Yeah. The Master of
Right.
Drums, Gene Krupa, and the Music He Gave the World. It is out now. You can find it wherever books are sold, and you can look for it at your nearest bookstore, bookedonrock.com. You can search for your nearest independent bookstore. So if you have one nearby, make sure you pick up a copy there. And can people reach out to you online, Liz, anywhere?
Yeah, well, they can go to my website, which is elizabethjrosenthal.com, and they can contact me through there if they want to, and certainly I'll be very happy to hear from them.
I'll put a link up in the show notes so people can go there. Liz, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.